very much looking forward to this as a panel discussion tonight, because so many of the problems we face are so interlinked. And if ever there was a time when we can see it so clearly, this slogan on the front, "Resistance is justified, Ferguson to Gaza," it's not just we ourselves who see this. This is understood increasingly around the world. There's huge resistance that is building. And we want a chance to evaluate that and also understand the problems that U.S. imperialism is having, because it's leading them to really insane, dangerous threats in every part of the world, and increasingly here. And the military that they exert around the world, in the past weeks, every one of us saw those same attack helicopters, tanks, cops that looked like they were troops in Afghanistan or in Iraq in the streets of Ferguson. And it's not just Ferguson. Every single police department in the country now has this equipment from the U.S. military. It's because they're so focused on fighting wars right here, just like they're fighting internationally. And it's because they view oppressed communities here absolutely through a lens of racism, and the conduct is the same as toward occupied people. Now, there is another part of the problem. There are things that we understand absolutely as Marxists about the economic problems that U.S. imperialism has, that are systematic and incurable, because it's based on the capitalist system, which is chaotic and irrational and unstable, and as we've said it again and again, at a dead end, unable to solve these problems. But we need to realize that those economic problems are also reflected politically, militarily. They have chaotic, irrational, unstable military machine that they themselves can no longer control, because they've set forces in motion, as John was just explaining about the Islamic State, ISIS, and other forces like that all over the world, who may, in their own sense, be out of control and be funded by allies of the U.S. who they want to keep a relationship with, such as Saudi Arabia, or in another situation, Israel, so on. So the capitalist state is in this desperate effort to avoid economic collapse, and it is setting in motion forces that it can't control politically and militarily. And we know the crises of capitalism, this constant, unplanned, enormous production that creates a glut, creates a famine at times of overproduction, creates complete depression and breakdown. But those breakdowns, as I say, become part of the system itself. And in this period, militarism is so interwoven with the imperialist state, and has been for decades, to prop up the imperialist order globally. And now, U.S. militarism in many ways is really out of control. There's no rational plan for U.S. global domination. There's a huge military apparatus, and it has competing command centers, numerous intelligence networks that operate and connect with different arms of the U.S. military and compete with each other, that are contending for position. And then there are thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of contractors. They're everything from mercenaries to, now, Edward Snowden. He was a private contractor. He had access to information all over the world, including U.S. secrets, many of them that he has really helped to expose. But it does show this privatization, even of the military and of the state apparatus, and how quickly things for them can get out of control, and also for the people of the whole world. So you have, and this is especially since 9/11, this privatization of the military. Not only the mercenary soldiers, the dogs of war, but everything from food service to equipment to surveillance to the purchases of billions of dollars from nuclear submarines, aircraft carriers, to the smallest screws. And the largest industries of the U.S. are absolutely dependent on this constant stream of profits. But it's no longer enough to sustain the system as a whole. That's their crisis. That is their problem. Now, U.S. policy has reinforced the most reactionary, sectarian, divisive, repressive regimes on the planet. I mean, when you look at Saudi Arabia or Kuwait or Qatar or the United Arab Emirates, just as examples, and each with their own U.S. supplied military machine that are in turn also contracted out to for-profit firms. Or you look at the military dictatorship in Egypt. The apparatus can be huge, and yet the inability to prevail, to succeed, to carry out the policy is what is absolutely impossible. You have the poorest country in the world, Afghanistan, and the U.S., after more than 10, 11 years of war, has nothing, and they can't trust any soldier that they are supposedly training. And they find this out again and again. Top generals have been executed by trusted people who were being trained. As a matter of fact, the top general who was just executed a couple of weeks ago, U.S. general, was sort of the top person in bringing in technology of an overall huge surveillance apparatus. He was the top specialist in this, brought in specially into Afghanistan. So that was a real loss, you can imagine, for the U.S. Now, I raise all this, and I'm going to both connect back to a point that John was making. It's not a case of being conspiracy theorists to explain that the U.S. created the forces that gave rise to ISIS, to the Islamic State. It's linked by thousands of threads to Saudi funding and so on. And the U.S. is at the same time, the U.S. government, committed to protecting these collaborators. But it can't, as I say, control the very reactionary policies that are unleashed. Now, the same thing you could look at Israel today. There may be a preference for a negotiated settlement with the Palestinians, but no matter what, the U.S. government will not abandon Israel or cut U.S. aid to Israel by a penny, or even threaten to do it for a hot minute, regardless of the war crimes committed, because they're bound to these reactionary alliances. They might call for the Egyptian military to respect a democratic election in Egypt. But at the same time, they're bound, imperialism is bound, to, and feels endangered and threatened by an elected government with any basis of popular support. That for them is risky. And so it's a case of seeking regime change everywhere. You know, so many people ask how all these governments, a popularly elected democratic governments, what a huge achievement, and just totally overthrown. They make no bones about it. Now, there was a NATO meeting this past week in Wales, Cardiff, Wales, right? And it really was almost an insane situation, because what was the U.S. pressing every NATO member to do? Demanding that they do was give at least 2% of their gross national product to the NATO military machine. Now, that's a huge demand that these imperialist economies that are in trouble themselves give a significant chunk of their profits to subsidizing what are U.S. military industries. And they all know that. Now, their industries will get a little bit in it too. There's always all different deals to sweeten the pot. But really, that was the essential demand. And that was being sold through a hysteria that the Ukraine was being invaded by Russia. Now, a very interesting thing happened as the U.S. was claiming that there was an invasion and even showing footage of tanks and equipment that they said was going over the border. See, they've created apparatuses. There is an Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. That's the OSCE. And they're supposed to monitor troop movements and so on. And you have the rather embarrassing situation that they claim that they're Russian troops and Russian equipment and Russian tanks, and that there's an invasion happening in the Ukraine, and the OSCE says, why, we don't see any sign of that at all. They issued a report saying nothing happening on the border. Now, this is an organization made up of all the NATO members, all the members of Europe, but you could only imagine they would issue that report if it showed there was a certain resistance. Some countries in Europe were sort of digging in their heels, because if it went down that, yes, there was an invasion, then what's the next step? It's really a very dangerous escalation. They had an additional problem that right in the midst of this, Putin made a call for a peace agreement. And of course, many countries immediately seized hold of that and said, yeah, let's talk about that. And at the same time, the resistance forces in East Ukraine had made some real gains and pushed the fascist dictatorship in Kiev way back, and really regained the airport in Lugansk and secured position in Donetsk and took a port on the Aral Sea and so on. Now, that was a big setback because they had invited the Ukraine to this NATO meeting. Ukraine's not a member of NATO, but they got invited under the guise that they would be protected by NATO. And their military was doing disastrously during that week. Now, just days before the NATO meeting was beginning, the other story was that there were Russian trucks that were invading Ukraine. 227 white panel supply trucks, bags of rice and grain and beans and sleeping bags and emergency tents and generators. And they came barreling over the border, and right away there were statements, actually, the State Department, saying this is an invasion, this is an attack on Ukraine's sovereignty. They, within less than 24 hours, distributed the material and left. Now, that's an even bigger problem. Who's ever heard of a U.S. invasion where in less than 24 hours they actually go back across the border? And so, and it wasn't only the U.S. doing it. Here's, Britain, the British Empire, who supported and been hand in glove with the U.S. in every invasion. There's 15 countries in the last 14 years that the U.S. has invaded. And none of them were 24 hours with sleeping bags and generators. So that didn't carry much weight either. There's certain things that are missing from the press immediately. Remember, there was an aircraft that was shot down, Malaysian airliner. And they said there was going to be a full report. They took the black box. They gave it to the Netherlands because the plane took off from Amsterdam. There are many Dutch citizens. The Dutch said, we'll have a report out within the week. They later, I don't know, 2-3 weeks went by, they said, well, we're not going to make a report. What does that mean? And all of the surveillance records from the Ukrainian government, their air traffic controllers had ordered this plane hundreds of miles off course and directly over Donetsk. They simply refused to provide their records. Now, of course, the U.S. has any number of satellites and radar and monitoring there in the region. So if there was any evidence to present, they could have just whipped out something, right? But they also haven't. As a matter of fact, it's completely out of the media. So these are important things to know, but at the same time to know that their wars are not going well for them. And yet, it doesn't mean that in any way they give up. They use far more and more extreme measures and more absolutely reactionary forces. In the midst of this, by the way, also last week, and this wasn't covered in the press here at all, but they're in negotiations with Iran, right? Supposedly on Iran having nuclear energy, something every country in the world is guaranteed they have a right to, but not Iran. So Iran has faced intense sanctions and finally did agree to what are called 5+1 talks. Talks were going on, and right in the middle of the talks, any further sanctions were to wait until next November. U.S. suddenly said 22 oil and banking companies were going to have new sanctions. Now, the Iranian government was shocked because they had been in good faith negotiations. Where did it come from? What was that even in a message to send? And it's an example of how completely competing and contending things that even seem to go against their own, what they're saying on the one hand publicly and what they're doing and carrying out are more and more contradictory. Now, it's more and more contradictory and impossible here at home. And not only in the U.S., we could look at any country in Europe facing austerity, but right here, when you consider the city of Detroit turning off the water, foreclosing on thousands and thousands of homes, a third of the population gone from Detroit. But that is what's the future for the population here. And a militarized state means that the military budget is the only thing that is guaranteed to grow. And in order for it to grow and balance a budget, every year, at least 5% has to be cut of the federal funds to state and city governments. This really means crumbling cities here. It means, of course, an increase in low-wage workers and conditions here becoming worse for a military machine that is growing and yet less able to provide. Now, it's important also, though, for us to know when there's a victory and a huge step forward. And so I want my last comments to talk about the impact from Gaza. Because we can evaluate the Israeli destruction in Gaza, 5 minutes, okay? 2 ways. We, of course, want to look at a third of the housing destroyed. The hospitals, the schools, the infrastructure, the water. A population the size of Brooklyn without electricity now. Or it sputters on for a few hours a day with generators. the conditions are far, far worse. Yet saying that, it's important to recognize that there were huge celebrations in the streets in Gaza last week. They were literally dancing in the street, and the leadership of the Palestinian, of Hamas and the other armed groups came out of hiding to join the celebration. Now, why would the Palestinians see this as a huge victory? I mean, in the rubble, in the ruin. It's because Israel failed. So it's their victory. Now, that's important, given the incredible odds of the most high-tech military machine with all the latest equipment from the U.S. And yet they failed to divide the Palestinians politically. That's a huge step, even if it's on paper between Hamas and Fatah and all of the other groups who collaborated together, Islamic Jihad and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and all of the popular resistance organizations in Gaza. So they failed to divide the Palestinian movement, which they have succeeded in doing, unfortunately, many times in the past. The pressure was so intense that they could break off the moderate forces. They failed to disarm the Palestinians. Now that was really enormous. And at the end, even the Israelis couldn't claim that this was a victory, that they were determined they were going to disarm the Palestinians, right? And in the end, they even had to admit, well, probably a third of the rockets still remain, the arms remain, the tunnel networks remain, and the military infrastructure, these resistance organizations who have learned how to wage struggles with the small arms that they could smuggle in through these miles of tunnels. Miles of tunnels. It's really quite incredible. The tunnels extended into Israel, they came up in some bases in Israel. That was important. Israel had more casualties than the last two incursions put together. It was like what happened to them in Lebanon, where they were unable to take a square foot. And they couldn't go into any of the Palestinian cities. They could bomb it from the air to rubble, and they did. They did. But they could not take the soldiers into those areas. That's a huge step. So they couldn't divide, they couldn't disarm, and the Palestinian people were undefeated. Now, these are how many defeats and setbacks have the Palestinian movement had, and always has arisen again. But this time, it really was a new day. In a huge way. There are more than 2,000 casualties, deaths, 500 of them children. Many, the overwhelming majority civilians. But the rallies in Gaza showed that the people themselves, and this was true in polls, and what was maybe most important was it wasn't just in Gaza. Among Palestinians within the 48 borders of Israel. That was a bold, for years Israel doesn't even recognize the Palestinians within Israel as Palestinians. They refer to them as Israeli Arabs, always trying to make it separate. There's very distinct, one policy to the West Bank, one to Gaza, and one to the Palestinians living within Israel. This time the Palestinians held a victory celebration in Israel. That was huge. There was a big rally, a Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine in the West Bank. And there were big arrests also of PFLP for the role that they had played in Gaza. And this is the secular left and revolutionary forces who are also strengthened by this struggle. So another thing happened. Of course, Netanyahu, not surprisingly, the very same day that the Palestinians were declaring victory, he declared victory. Said this is a great military achievement. But absolutely no one believed it. As a matter of fact, his popularity has fallen from 82% to, it was like 30% and falling. As a matter of fact, they use terms about it being in free fall. They kind of couldn't count and they weren't asking anymore. So this really is an example of organized, armed resistance that is a lesson heard, felt, internalized around the world. The Palestinian statement was that their unity was their biggest accomplishment. More than the military victory. They said, our unity. We're not going to go back to being divided. There was an effort last year for a group very much like ISIS to get a foothold in Gaza. Didn't succeed. It actually was pushed back by the United Palestinian Movement, militarily defeated. So this is the kind of thing that we want to really take heart, because it has also strengthened the boycott, divest, sanctions movement. It's strengthened the movement all over the world. And right here at home, the number of people who were in the streets here represents a new day. The number of people, especially youth, who identify with the Palestinian movement and who make the connections between the police here and the destruction of the Israeli soldiers, who make all kinds of connections about the struggle against racism and the struggle against apartheid in Israel. That shows that there are links and solidarity that we can build. And this has always been the view of the party, but in a way, these developments are coming into their own. And that's what we want to be more and more tuned and aware of, both resistance and knowing that this is a dying system that has nothing to offer except more repression, more military, more cuts, more austerity. But organized resistance can make a really powerful impact.